You're listening to the Physio Matters podcast this month in association with rehabmypatient.com, and this is session 89. Welcome back to the Physio Matters podcast. I'm Jack Chew. Delighted to be delivering this episode. Really been looking forward to it quite some time, as me and Rob Goodwin get into in a second. Before we do, a word from our sponsor. We've been using rehabmypatient.com for quite some time now. It's really applicable across the board in practice. But I thought one of the things that was interesting about this episode, which is about all things first contact practice and the UK policies to bring physiotherapists to the first contact role in GP primary care predominantly, and rehabmypatient.com is quite uniquely placed as exercise prescription software to really help with that because of its ease of use and the speed of which it can deliver advice sheets and exercise programs to them. So I thought I'd just get Tim from Rehab My Patient, who's its founder and director, to tell us a little bit about the software and how it's being used in this context. Tim, thanks for joining me briefly at the start of this podcast. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how Rehab My Patient is being used in first contact roles particularly, and a little bit about the software as well, if you don't mind.
Hi Jack, thanks very much for having me on. Rehab My Patient is an amazing exercise prescription tool, and it's currently used in over 100 primary care networks, with over 400 GP sites using Rehab My Patient now. And one of the challenges with FCP is these shorter appointment times. And with Rehab My Patient, you can easily prescribe an exercise plan in under 1 minute. And if you create a template, then you can prescribe an exercise plan in under 15 seconds. It's like so quick, and we're busy. We don't have the time to spend on making a complicated exercise plan. We can just send one so fast, and you can also send it by SMS or WhatsApp it to your patient, or email them a PDF of their plan, and you can attach advice sheets. We've got over 470 MSK advice sheets, and we've just recently shot a whole bunch of exercises for the older population, which is perfect for primary care and for the arthritic patients. It just works so well. And not only that, but we've also got our sister site, Rehab Me, where you can actually put patients on a course of video exercises and for common conditions, for common back problems, for disc problems, for hamstring strains, and just AccuRx them the link. It fits perfectly into the MSK pathway. So if you want to get access, you can go to rehabmypatient.com/physio matters or www.rehabme.com.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks to Rehab My Patient for their continued support for Physio Matters, but also for Therapy Live, which is now, tickets are on sale. Go to therapy-live.co.uk/tickets to snap yours up. Free, of course, and you can purchase access to the recordings of this and every other show we've done on site as well for a bargain. Really excited for that. 10 streams of education, mixed methods of delivery with keynotes, panels, debates, interviews. It's going to be belting. We've got all the streams announced on there, so do check it out and get your tickets to what will be another landmark cultural moment. Oh, forgive the noise there, some seagulls in the background. We've just finally got to my in-laws' caravan in Wales for the first time in a long time because of all the lockdowns and stuff. So yeah, you're going to get more ambient background noise on this intro than usual. So get your tickets, don't be shy, because they will, as per usual, sell out. So make sure you get yours to what will be another big landmark event in MSK world. We've got, as per usual, some innovative streams, including orthopedics, pediatrics, as well as all your favourites across core skills and the body parts, the lymposiums as we like to call them. So yeah, therapy-live.co.uk to get your ticket. So anyway, today's episode is a pretty special one for me because it's a bit of a blast from the past. Rob Goodwin was one of my first clinical leads in a really important role in my career, as you'll hear a little bit about at Nottingham City Care Partnership. And Rob, we're quite a pioneer in many ways clinically, and we don't get into that as much as I'd like, and hopefully me and Rob can have future conversations on and off air about that sort of stuff. But he also did his PhD into a release review into a first contact practice and what he considers to be an advancement of the professional project of physiotherapy, and undifferentiated patients being seen in various different contexts. Now, Rob's work has been lauded by some, and he's been considered a heretic by others, for various different conclusions that he's come to, which admittedly I'll bandwagon myself on this a bit, is that it does overlap significantly with mine, and many of you will notice that this is not dissimilar to some of the rhetoric that we've been putting out for years, including 5 years ago on a podcast with Karen Middleton, where we were questioning the differences that were being inferred between first contact and self-referral, when for the patients the access is the key variable. So really enjoyed getting into this with Rob. Hope you enjoy it too, and please do let us know, give us the feedback at TPM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, etc. And like and share. And please do, if you would, send us a review wherever you might be listening to this, on iTunes and the like. It really does make a difference to the algorithms these days in an otherwise saturated podcast landscape. We're probably a bit shy to sometimes promote those bits and pieces, but they are important. So if you don't mind and you enjoy what we do, then please do let us know on those and help boost our ratings and reviews. All right, take care. I'll see you at the other side. I'm delighted to be here today with Rob Goodwin, and the declaration before we start is that me and Rob used to work together in Nottingham, something that I only assume you don't like to admit to, but yeah, we did work together in a service called Nottingham City Care. Still something I talk about an awful lot, and still put their logo up on many of my slides as something that I consider to be a real foundational experience in my MSK journey and my career. And so, although I'm not going to say we've always kept in touch necessarily, it's been a pleasure to observe his work as he's gone into an clinical academic role and pursued his PhD in something that we're both now passionate about, first contact practice. So I'm delighted to get him on. I would say, admittedly, this is probably what I consider the most long-awaited podcast ever, because when I conceived of Physio Matters, I don't know if Rob remembers this, but I conceived of Physio Matters and he was on my very first shortlist at that point to talk about developing and managing a great service, of which I felt I was working within at the time. And I did say at the time to him that this was what I was thinking and planning to do, but this is now, 9 years ago? So here he is, 9 years in the making. Rob Goodwin, thank you for coming on Physio Matters. Could you just introduce yourself to the listeners, if you would, please?
Yeah, certainly, Jack. Thank you very much. Before I do a little bit of an introduction of myself, just a couple of things, really. First of all, some thank yous. So thank you to you for inviting me. As you say, I think the first time we spoke about doing an FCP podcast was probably 3 or 4 years ago. So it's taken a bit of time, but it's great to be here this morning. Secondly, I just want to acknowledge my employers, Nottingham City Care, who you've mentioned. They've been fantastically supportive of me and my research and my continued research career. I'd also like to acknowledge the CSP for their support and funding towards the research that I've done. And I think it's also really important for me just to sort of acknowledge all of those people who have had to put up with me asking questions and probing over the last sort of 7 or 8 years, really, Jack, that I've been sort of talking to people about FCP services. I think the other thing to say is that a lot of what I'm going to speak about today comes from the evidence, so the research that I've been doing. But I also expect that one of the reasons that you've asked me onto the show is do you call it a show?
We are, show, podcast, sessions.
Okay. I want to sessions.
On the show, you're on the show.
Okay, is for me to express my own personal opinion. So I will be doing that as well. But hopefully that comes from a sort of particularly or relatively well-informed position to be able to offer my personal opinion. So does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. No, that's good. Get all the caveats in place beforehand, just as I did with regards to our previous relationship, because I think that it is relevant. That context is relevant. This is something you've lived and breathed for a long time. And also the unique circumstances that exist around Nottingham City Care, for example, is a social enterprise of which it's been established about 10 years now, I think, ish.
Just 10 years, yeah.
For me, that is relevant to its ability to have creative services. It's also one of the most long-standing and consistent self-referral services, which I think we will come to. And then similarly, because of its flexibility, has been able to afford you opportunities to pursue things like this, as well as to create pathways and services that are what I consider to be unique and best in class in many ways across the country. Having now worked in many different places and had the unique experience of then being invited to visit many services, I still hold it in such high regard. And so, I'm glad you mentioned them and their support. I'm glad that's continued.
Good, thank you, Jack. So a little bit about me. I qualified, ostensibly my career doesn't look particularly exciting. I qualified from what was then Nottingham School of Physiotherapy in 1990, and I've worked in Nottingham ever since. So I'm not particularly well travelled. I did my basic rotation, Senior 1 and Senior 2 at Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham, and then started to develop a particular interest in pain services, And I suppose what really interested me in pain services was the sort of psychological component of sort of long-term pain in particular. So I got sort of leaning towards sort of psychological interventions and the psychological component of the biopsychosocial framework. And so I worked at a rehabilitation centre in Nottingham for about 10 years, established a pain management programme, and then the opportunity came for me to take up my current post, which was a clinical lead at Nottingham City Care. And really it was that sort of move to Nottingham City Care where, as you've said, when I joined the team, they'd already had self-referral for 3 years. And it was that experience really of moving to Nottingham City Care that really started to pique my interest and started to make me ask questions around self-referral and patient access to physiotherapy as a first point of contact.
So that's one of the places that I really wanted to start, because it's an acronym that's everywhere, and 3-letter acronyms are, that's a physio modus operandi, it seems. So what is FCP? How would you describe it?
Well, I suppose to answer that question, Jack, it probably needs me to go back to the sort of antecedents of my interest in FCP. And as I've said, that was self-referral physiotherapy. So you will know from your time when you worked with us here at City Care that the MSK service is incredibly busy. We get about 1,500 referrals a month. When you were with us, we were already at that point getting 900,000 referrals a month. And again, on the face of it, these referrals are self-referral physiotherapy referrals. However, again, as you know, Jack, when you speak to these patients, the majority of them have already been to see their GP.
Yeah.
So in my mind, it just didn't make sense. You know, these were people who were essentially filling in a form themselves and referring themselves to physiotherapy, but they'd already been to see a GP. So we're going back to about sort of 2012 here. And around about this time, you probably couldn't go much longer than a fortnight without reading or hearing or seeing on the TV a story that was coming out of general practice about the travails of the general practitioner workforce. We have an aging population, we have increased burden in general practice, we had an aging GP workforce with difficulty training, retaining and recruiting GPs to the workforce. And so there were very frequently headlines in the press about the unsustainability of general practice. So for me, what I was seeing is a lot of patients that we were subsequently seeing have already been to see the GP. Well, surely if they came to see us first, that would decrease the burden on GPs. And it just made complete and utter logical sense to me. I couldn't see anything really contentious about that at all. So on the back of that, I went to the commissioners. And at that time, it was when you had when I had very close relationships with the commissioners. And I put this proposal to them to test out a very boundaried model where patients saw a physiotherapist as a genuine first contact. And we trialed that for a year in 2 GP practices in Nottingham City. And that's where that bore the first evaluation of what has become known as FCP. So, but really, the motivation for me to move to the point of FCP was via self-referral physiotherapy. And the questions about what was it about self-referral physiotherapy that, in my mind, didn't seem to have achieved what it set out to achieve.
And I think that that's something that I'm interested to explore a little further, and I think we might as well go there now, is that what do you think it is about that then was just not being necessarily implemented? So, for example, and I think that the stats are similar now, is that even though we're a self-referred service and that most of the self-referrals we received, I think maybe 8 out of 10 of those, 80% of them were referral forms that GPs had given someone following a consultation. And so it wasn't ever a true self-referral. And it also, and I just want to admit that this is how I felt at the time, is that there was a degree of complacency that would sometimes set in from the GPs, knowing that once they sort of recognized, okay, this is MSK, I'm pretty confident of that. They then, instead of having it's good because they didn't have the admin burden of having to then make a referral, but it also meant that they were sometimes a little cavalier about just being able to give the forms out or to pick a form out on the way out. And so what do you think it is about self-referral that wasn't necessarily cutting through and truly generating that input that meant that physios at that point would have been first contact?
I think it's complicated. I think that one of the things was the sort of geographical dislocation between the general practice and the self-referral physiotherapy service. So it was a they saw it as a different service. It sat somewhere else. So they saw they was referring to somewhere else rather than it being part and parcel of the services that are part of general practice and maybe embedded within general practice. I think they saw it as something separate. I think that, there's definitely a burden element to it in terms of, before self-referral, GPs had to complete the referral form themselves. So, that was quite onerous for them. When you think about the proportion of patients that are referred for physiotherapy and the proportion of patients with MSK problems that GPs see. So I think that they saw it as a sort of, an absolution really of that administrative burden, as you've said. And that's obviously gone a step further now. They don't even have to give the patients a form. They give the patients a sort of a web address so they can refer themselves online, or they give them a telephone number and that's it. And that's on a business card. So they have a pile of business cards on the desk next to them. They just hand it to the patients. And I think there's something also quite interesting about that relates to FCP in terms of governance and safety. And I think that comes in a little bit, particularly when we are, as a profession, so cognizant of sort of governance and patient safety in particular, and particularly around red flags. And one of the sort of perhaps unexpected outcomes of FCP might be, again, I've had GPs say to me, if a patient now mentions they've got an MSK problem, I won't even look at the MSK problem. I'll just say to them, well, go to reception and book in to see the FCP. And I think, when we're so cognizant of patient safety, I just wonder whether that is a bit of an adverse consequence of FCP, that GPs are perhaps not maybe practicing quite as vigilantly. And there's no evidence of that at all. But I think it's just perhaps one of those unexpected outcomes of FCP.
That's tough to track, though, isn't it? I mean, it's something that I think it speaks to what I was describing as I described as complacency, although one that I understand that came from even self-referral. But I think that process is something that the time frame between them making that call and the person being seen, if that is small, if that time window is small, from them saying, as soon as I'm hearing them mention a knee, I'm zoning out and reaching for my card, right? And we can comprehend why that would be. And we can also comprehend that we're trying to almost motivate some of that behavior. Just send us your MSK patients. We've got the skills, we've got the competence to see them even sooner than you would. If there's a gap, though, and that does end up being serious pathology, a time gap that's relevant there, and sometimes you can think of the relevance of what pathologies that might be. That relevance could be even hours, never mind days or weeks. That becomes really important. And then the governance and the sort of causal point of safety on insurance, on litigation becomes really quite complex. Does that count as an assessment? Him hearing those words and then reaching for that card, even if it's in a waiting room, that does that lawyers would have a field day trying to work out whether that's an assessment or not. And so these questions, it kind of, for me at least, and I'm sure we'll get into this deeper into the podcast, is it irritates me that I feel like I recognize some of this conversation in early conversations, even between us when we work together. And I know you've had them ever since and stuff. And obviously I've been out being a much broader generalist necessarily, but that fascinates me that still remains a bit unanswered, unexplored in many ways until your research, I guess. What then piqued your interest further in pursuing a PhD into it then? Like, why was it just the gappiness of this conversation, or what?
So it was the gappiness of that, what we've spoken about already, but also the gappiness in terms of patients and their awareness and understanding. So again, Jack, you will know this, that these people who had been told to refer by their GP, they completed the self-referral form, they phoned up and self-referred themselves to physiotherapy. Occasionally what you would find is somebody who'd been to the service previously would the next time self-refer of their own volition, but not always. Some patients still went back to see their GP. So that was an interesting thing. What was it about the sort of hierarchy and the dominance of medicine that made people default to the GP as a first point of contact for most healthcare problems, even MSK problems, when they'd seen a physiotherapist in the past? So that was interesting, and I wanted to explore that. But the other thing was, patients had when you spoke to the patients who had been told to refer, why didn't you self-refer? Well, I didn't know. I didn't know the service existed. I had no idea that I could self-refer to physiotherapy. They were just blown away. Do you mean I could have phoned up here and come through making a phone call myself? Yes, of course, that's what self-referral physiotherapy is. But people just didn't do it. People didn't do it. And I thought that was really, really interesting as well. So that was the other thing that sort of, I wasn't particularly bothered about does self-referral physiotherapy get patients better or not. I hoped that it did. And if it didn't, then we'd have to take a very long, hard look at ourselves, because that's what we do. And that's what we've been doing for 100 so years. So again, perhaps naively, I gave that as a bit of a given. But it was these complexities and these more nuanced things that really, really interested me and sort of made me pursue doing a PhD. I think the other thing that's a little bit lost, Jack, which I think is also really important for us to think about during this conversation, but also more widely as a profession, is about 4 months through this 1-year evaluation, which was in 2 GP practices, the commissioners summoned us to their office, and we thought, oh gosh, what's happened? And they said, we want to roll this out across the whole of Nottingham. We want to roll it out to 20 GP practices. We would roll it out to more GP practices, but the other GP practices haven't got room for it. So I can remember sitting in the office and said, okay, so what do you want? And they said, oh, we want exactly the same as we've got in those 2 GP practices. And at that time, they were 2 Band 7 physiotherapists working in those GP practices. So we were looking at instantaneously recruiting 7 or 8 Band 7 physiotherapists for these, what are now called FCP roles. Now, my management at that time were really nervous about that, and they balked at that. And within that sort of process of a half-hour conversation, we had negotiated taking it down from a Band 7 to a Band 6. Okay. Now, there were some caveats that came with that. They would not be advanced practitioners. They would be Band 6 physiotherapists, and they would have a Band 7 who led the team and would provide day-to-day sort of resource for clinical problems and decision-making, etc. And this has been a little bit lost in the discourse and narrative over the last 7 years, because 2 colleagues who I work with, who Karen Martini and Rich Kelly, they wrote this up, this 20 GP practice Band 6 service that was there with non-substantive money for about 18 months. They saw over 10,000 patients. There were no adverse incidents recorded, and the outcomes, and those outcomes were onward referrals to secondary care, referrals. They couldn't refer for diagnostics, they couldn't do injections, they had to go to the GP and talk to them about accessing those things. But the incidence of them having to seek that support from GPs was exactly the same as the advanced practitioners who had access to referring to secondary care and referring for diagnostics. There was no difference at all in terms of the proportion of patients that they referred through for those activities. Patient satisfaction levels were equitable with the Band 7 service, and GP satisfaction, we didn't measure GP satisfaction in my evaluation, but it was high for the Band 6 service. Now, Karen put in an abstract to Congress, which was accepted. It was peer reviewed, as I presume, as part of that acceptance. But that story's been a little bit lost from the FCP narrative in terms of just the sort of vision and concept of FCP. And I think that's just worth mentioning as well, and perhaps picking up at some point.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's something that I found really interesting because it coincided, and it's not not because of this. It was purely geography that drew me away reluctantly from working for City Care. But essentially, it was around that time that I then had left that service, then worked in various different places, of which wasn't as good a fit, which made me always hark back and also therefore read about some of the, especially the published work, or that Richard kindly shared drafts of some of that stuff. Or I still had close friends, of course, working on that coalface that would then keep me informed of it, and quite exciting developments. One of the challenges that I made, especially when it was published and I really gave it some thought, that I know I've brought up with you privately, but let's talk about it now, is I felt that through no fault of yours, in fact, it's a great asset in many ways, but I felt that the band sixes described there are, for me, at least as thinkers, underpaid sevens in many ways. They just perhaps I'm overinflating this because that's where I cut my teeth. Maybe I'm doing so as to say, oh, the apprenticeship I had at City Care therefore made me what I am. But generally speaking, and I'll embarrass them by name dropping, people like Danny Smart, Emma Ratcliffe, Ed Lee, I'm probably missing some people out I shouldn't now, but generally they were Rich Barnes. These are people that, for me, were at least on a clinical reasoning level, had been through the mire that I had when we're coming through on a self-referred service, just needing to be more cognizant of flags, not having and having a supervision governance that was, now I realise, second to none. That meant that for me, it almost cooked the books of that outcome data in a way, because it's kind of like, that is not, and especially having then done a bit more traveling around the country and thinking that isn't necessarily a representative six. And I don't know how, there's a je ne sais quoi to that, right? That's bloody subjective. That's Jack's take on the matter, and it's hard. But I still look back on that, and obviously read it again ahead of this conversation, and thought, there's something to be said there, right? The legacy of the competency framework that was around your service, from you, Rich, Karen, Andy, Prophet before that, just people putting Nancy Manners, I'm going to fail to mention names, I'm just going to stop at that. But it's just that these were people that had really given thought to this ahead of the curve. And that must have then set the scene for those sixes to flourish and for that data to show what it did. Do you think I'm overstating that?
No, I don't think you are wholly. I think there is still some value in those wider conversations, and that's also things that people have said to me in the research that I've been doing over the last sort of 7 or so years around skill mix and workforce. And I'm sure we might pick this up later, but I think there is some truth in what you're saying as well. The other thing that I've reflected on, Jack, is that the nature, so a big sort of argument for the advanced level practice within the FCP role is the undifferentiated nature of the patients that are seen. And this has also made me reflect a little bit about the model of service that we have. So patients who self-refer to our service, taking into account they're probably not self-referred, they've been told to refer. If they do that online, they complete a very, very brief web form online. So they have a drop-down selection of what the problem is. So that might be back pain, it might be leg pain, it might be neck pain, it might be shoulder and arm pain, something like that. They have a couple of questions which are red flag orientated questions. Have you had any problems with your bladder and bowel? Screening questions, which if they click that, it pops up and says, go and see your GP, to sort of try and get rid of those red flag patients. But what that means is, whether you're a band 5, a band 6, a band 7 within our service, when you open that referral, that's all you get. That's all the information you get. Now, that's pretty undifferentiated in my eyes. So I think that what that means is that where you have come from and the experience you have can set you up more strongly or less strongly for the FCP role. And a lot of people, not all, but a lot of people who I've spoken to over the last 7 or so years are physiotherapists who've moved into these roles from secondary care. Now, secondary care is likely to be a very different kettle of fish in terms of the information you get. Those patients aren't very likely to be undifferentiated to that extent. Yeah. And I think that that's what puts, like yourself, like Danny, Laura, Emma, etc., sort of 6 or 7 years ago, in an advantageous position. And I think that's what we're seeing in some of the experiences of the FCPs that we have just recruited to the sort of existing rollout of FCP services. So I was telling you just before we started of an undergraduate project where the question was asked, how often are you using advanced practice skills? Now, the first question was around those things that we think more frequently and commonly of as advanced practice skills, such as injections, etc., etc. And very sort of similar to other findings, they said they used those skills infrequently, around about 5% of the time. And I think that mirrors the work of the Frontier team down in Bristol when they asked a similar question. But we also, and I got this question put in explicitly, asked them, how often do you feel you're using advanced practice musculoskeletal clinical reasoning skills? Now, they said, or 50% of the physiotherapists who are working FCP said that they used advanced clinical reasoning skills in less than half of their patients. Okay, so what they're saying is that was over half of the physiotherapists said that they felt that they needed advanced skills in less than half of the patient population. We asked the question the other way around, how often do you think people need more basic musculoskeletal physiotherapy skills? And you can debate what that means. But they said that 2/3 of the patients required more basic physiotherapy skills. Now, again, you can look at that two ways. Some of these physiotherapists, and I hope they don't mind me saying this, are probably in the first quarter of their career if they work for as long as, if they're unlucky enough to work for as long as I have. So, you know, on the whole scheme of things, they're probably early career Band 7 physiotherapists. So you could say, what you don't know, you don't know. And I think there is a real argument for that. But you could also say that the way that our service is designed and delivered has set them up for this sort of uncertainty and unpredictability of this undifferentiated type of patient. So I think that it does depend a lot on where you've come from.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what's interesting, because of course the subjectivity between what is basic and advanced as perceived is a fascinating conversation in itself, because you can't, if I try to put myself back into my shoes as a Band 5 in your service, and by the way, at that point I was recruited in to an MSK Band 5 role. It's one of the things that attracted me in primary care, and I really wanted to see that variety. And I also absolutely, unlike some of my colleagues who came to love it eventually, but I loved the uncertainty. I loved the risk of a sorts of the fact that I just had a self-referral with a name on it, a date of birth if I were lucky, and it said knee, right? And I loved the fact that, whereas others were really irritated by that and wanted that bit more detail to reflect on ahead of time. But then if I think about what I was needing to do with that, and also was supported through appropriate competency framework and great supervision, often shoulder-to-shoulder supervision across curtain, meant that I was then able to then make sure that then my differential reasoning over masqueraders and flags, etc., was such that if that's advanced reasoning, I was having to do it 9-month qualified when I joined the service. So if you're arguing that that's advanced reasoning, you've got to start then recognizing that has consequence to what is the competence of which we're graduating professionals, really. That is, it has those sorts of consequences. Now, that conversation needs to therefore be had, because on first contact, in terms of who is, if a physiotherapist is seeing someone, in this case with sore bits, as the first professional that they see, we've got to understand that part of what we're graduating people into as per our bachelors and signing the HCPC register is as autonomous clinicians. And if they work in private practice, if they work in occupational health settings, if they work in sporting context, that is something that is implied. It doesn't mean that they're brilliant at it, but they're competent at it. And so therefore, by implication, in inferring that first contact in GP practice under this new model, therefore needs to be advanced practice, is it's implying something as to the competence of those graduates. And I've been at pains, and on this podcast we had Karen Middleton on years ago, and I really struggled to articulate that and make sure that for me, the self-referral come FCP was a distinction without a difference. And it's something that our listeners have then, on a fairly regular basis, got in touch with us saying, did that point ever land? And so I ask you the question, did that point ever land, Rob? Is there something that between self-referral and what is now conceived of as FCP, on a patient level in terms of access and in terms of what we're implying on the profession, is there a relevant difference there?
Well, I think you know my view on this, Jack, and I've had my fingers burnt for expressing it in the past. I think that fundamentally they are the same thing. So let's imagine you're somebody in Nottingham City, where I work, and you wake up this morning with a bad back, and you're fortuitous enough to know that there is a self-referral service, and you've got the telephone number. You pick the phone up and you refer yourself to that service. So, at the moment, our waiting list is remarkable because of COVID. In a week's time, you might have an appointment to see a physiotherapist. Now, that's first contact. In my mind, that is a first contact, and that's how self-referral physiotherapy was set up and conceived. And because of my own uncertainty and unsuredness, I had this conversation with Leslie Holdsworth and Jill Gamblin, who were pioneers of both Physio Direct telephone, and obviously Leslie Holdsworth was absolutely the pioneer and champion of self-referral physiotherapy in Scotland. And unless I misunderstood the conversations that we had, then that was how they saw self-referral physiotherapy working. And I think the question that's really important for us as a profession, and we need to think about this because it has relevance to FCP, is why is it that self-referral perhaps didn't achieve its ultimate outcome in terms of people using it more often? And I think that was a bit of a double-edged sword, because one of the concerns about self-referral was that it would be that services would be overrun. There'd be a tidal wave. That was part of the rhetoric around, coming from the medical profession, these services will be overrun. And physiotherapy as a profession was very proud to say, well, no, it's not overrun. Well, probably the reason it wasn't overrun is because nobody knew about it. So nobody was referring themselves to it anyway. And that is a danger that is relevant, or a caution that's relevant to FCP, because, in my mind, what we need to do is we need to market physiotherapy as the default first contact practitioner for people who have MSK problems. If that marketing campaign was absolutely fantastically effective, then I suspect there wouldn't be enough capacity within physiotherapy services. So there is some caution to be exercised about doing that. But if we have a very, very long-term vision about where we see physiotherapy, musculoskeletal physiotherapy being 10, 15, 20 years hence, then those are the aspirations in my mind that we should be aiming for. And I tried to sort of coin this phrase, I wouldn't see my doctor with a toothache, because this is what happened in dentistry. Dentistry achieved a monopoly over the treatment of dental care. Now you still have people who go to see the dentist and it's not a dental problem, it's a medical problem, and they're sent to see the doctor. But on the whole, if you wake up in the morning and you notice that your blood pressure is elevated, but you've got a toothache, you don't think, well, I'll book in to see the doctor for both of them. You book in to see the doctor for your elevated blood pressure, but you still book an appointment to see the dentist for your toothache. Now, that's because dentistry is the default first contact practitioner for dental problems. And in my mind, that would be my aspiration and vision for musculoskeletal physiotherapy.
Absolutely. And I've always trying to look for angles of which I could try and be devil's advocate, but unfortunately in this instance I completely agree in every which way, including the aspiration. I think that aspiration is relevant in terms of philosophical terms as to first principles. You look at it and think, when you strip it back and you look at it from a few different angles, that is what we want as an outcome, is that someone would understand and perceive that they are with the access, and if they knew about that access, then that's what they would do. Now, it seems therefore that the only real distinction that can be made is the context of which they will be seen, right? The location or the trappings of that service, right? So same person wakes up with back pain, knows of the suite of options that they have available in that locality. They self-refer to physiotherapy. Now they therefore attend, especially if they've got choice in terms of location. They attend whereby they can get an appointment on an online booked service. Not dissimilar to someone going to my private website, by the way, right? So I sat here in a studio of which is in a private practice, in which that's exactly what they do, right? They know of me. By the way, we're only one location, but essentially that's what they do. Now, same person that might know of the local NHS service, they could do exactly the same thing into that NHS service. So therefore, the first contact practice model that we're talking about in the UK now, that is inferred to be distinct from what we're describing, is simply that care delivery is in a GP practice of which they're registered, or an associated building. Is that correct?
I think that's a big part of it, and I think that's a really big, important part of it. But there are lots and lots of different models of FCP services. Some patients might phone their GP. They might be signposted to an FCP service, but that FCP service might be some distance away for them. So it might not even be that sort of that straightforward, Jack. But without a doubt, having the physiotherapist within the GP practices is a really important feature in my mind through the work that I've done for FCP services. Now, as I say, if we did see this whole scale shift for patients with MSK problems to true first contact, it would take quite a bit of thinking about, because what's amazed me is the number of times people say, we would have FCP, but we haven't got any space. There's no room to accommodate a physiotherapist within the practice. And when those are the barriers, that's incredibly frustrating. But it does mean there has to be some really sort of broader thinking about the whole MSK pathway and making that as seamless as possible. Now, the model what's really interesting is that when I first started doing this and we did that very first evaluation, I thought, blimey, we've got a model here that should be replicable and transferable across the country. And the actual fact of the matter is that it isn't, because of lots of reasons. But what I'm coming round to over time is that the model that we have got here is a really good template for a seamless patient experience, because we as an organization have essentially the monopoly for MSK primary care physiotherapy. We also provide the majority of FCP services, which means that patients who require ongoing physiotherapy simply step sideways from the FCP service into the MSK service. We also are the interface service for patients who are referred through to secondary care. So we have the gatekeeping responsibility for those patients as well. So, and we work increasingly more closely with secondary care consultants in orthopedic and spinal surgery. We could further sort of develop those relationships, but it makes for a quite seamless patient experience. And I think that's really important. But there isn't the capacity for our MSK physiotherapy service all to move into general practice. But being in general practice has some really important features of embedding FCP services within the community.
The model of FCP that you're describing there, of which you're therefore most supportive of and an advocate of because of your involvement, as well as this being an applied version of your own learning, no doubt, from you having influenced it so greatly over time, as well as then obviously the academic pursuit that's going to have informed this work. How far does that differ as it stands from the, although, like you said, I granted there are variations that exist, but it's kind of ascribed in policy and it's proliferating at quite a rate. So how much does the model you're describing as what you perceive as optimal in this circumstance, how does that compare to the model as it's being rolled out?
Well, there's so much variety, and although I've described a model that I think is really quite exemplary in terms of patient experience and patient journey and the seamlessness of it, what I've also realized over time is that perhaps I have come to realize it's a model that can also sort of tolerate greater flexibility as well. And I think that that's something that we as a profession, so whether that's flexibility around workforce and skill mix, which we've touched on already, or whether that's flexibility around what the physiotherapist can practically do. And I want to give you an example of that working in reality.
Okay.
So I'm currently doing a bit of work for the CSP, interviewing people in Northern Ireland and in the Highlands of Scotland. Now, as you can imagine, some of those services are really, really remote. So the physiotherapists might see a patient once or twice, which is really the sort of the prerequisite for FCP. But they've got somebody who they have a sense from their experience they could see another couple of times, and they would really get them on board, and they'd move them on in their journey to the point of saying, you're fine, you can self-manage. Or they refer them through to the existing MSK service, which might be a 2-hour round trip journey to the local. That's right. So, you know, it makes sense for them to have some flexibility in the FCP model and see those patients a few more times.
Sure.
But again, that's really important for us to think about, because that takes up some capacity from their sort of FCP, traditional FCP model. Okay, so those are the sorts of things that we have to sort of think about, as I say, being flexible with the FCP model to allow for that variability and those contextual requirements, really. And I think that's really important that we do that. But again, that's accommodated if there is a supported shift to encouraging patients to access physiotherapy as a first point of contact, rather than, you know, some more boundaried model of what FCP should or shouldn't look like.
And do you think that in the framing of my question, I offered where the distinction might lie between what is considered to be optimal in your opinion and what is typical, let's say, even though do you think that the flexibility is the key component there, whereby the current implemented model as is described is something that therefore has more parameters around it that seem maybe restrictive, if I were to try and put words in your mouth?
Again, Jack, I think it's really complicated, because from our very first evaluation, what we found was that physiotherapists, so we had the two practices. One was a university practice, which was obviously very atypical. You know, the average age of the patient was 25.
Yeah.
The FCP in that practice saw the patients just over once on average. The FCP in the inner city practice saw the patients just under twice on average. GPs, interestingly, see patients for MSK problems on average just over twice. So it's not like GPs are treating these patients repeatedly time and time and time again. You know, these patients are sort of generally managed fairly effectively by GPs anyway. So it wasn't a question of, you know, it was a shifting of this workload burden, really, that was important.
The nature of the service of which you're describing as being near optimal, and then the sort of more blueprint that's been described, although of course we know there's variation amongst that, I would say, is it that is more restrictive, more parameterized, more limited in its scope and flexibility than what you're describing as the needs of what you think is an optimal service? Is that fair for me to put those words in your mouth a little?
I think that's reasonably fair. Yeah, I think that definitely what I've come to learn is that, you know, because of the contextual differences, it probably requires some flexibility in the model, and we can't have the sort of the sort of parameters of that model defined too strictly, because there will need to be some flexibility. So yes, I think you're probably right in terms of, you know, perhaps the existing model is a little bit restrictive. For all sorts of reasons, Jack. You know, we've spoken about workforce, we've spoken about skill mix, we've spoken about sort of rurality and urban situations. So and associated sort of, you know, pathways that patients experience. You know, I gave the example that we've got in Nottingham. That's very different to elsewhere. So yes, I think definitely flexibility is really important in the sort of the thinking about FCP services moving forward.
it brings me on to really one of the, I mean, we've definitely visited a lot of this already, but I really want to ask more pointedly, what do you see as being the key opportunities and challenges that FCP has in the UK?
Well, I mean, as I said before, I think that, for me, the vision is that, people get to the point of waking up and thinking, I've got what they would interpret, and this is the challenge, a musculoskeletal problem. I need to book an appointment to see a physiotherapist. I think where that physiotherapist is, to a certain extent, is less important. I think there are advantages of it being within the GP practice. But I think that, I mean, I have said sort of somewhat tongue in cheek that, in Nottingham City, the money that's being spent on FCP could have been spent on marketing the existing self-referral physiotherapy service to the population of Nottingham City in a way that meant that people access the service, and alongside that, putting up a sort of a restriction of people going to be able to see their GP with a musculoskeletal problem. Now, obviously, that's tongue in cheek, and it's just hypothetical, but it sort of gets the point across. It's about patients seeing a physiotherapist as a first point of contact. To me, that should be the aspiration that we're aiming for. Now, what my research shows is that if you put a physiotherapist within a GP practice, nobody knows they're there. The posters on the walls don't really have too much of an impact, but over time, the local population start to become aware that that service exists, in the same way as they did, for example, when the GP practice set up a breastfeeding clinic for new mums. It was advertised in the practice, nobody knew, but over time, the local population became aware of it. And the
nurse practitioner roles as well, with regards to when that's not just an awareness piece, but also the fact that when someone goes to book, it's then are you okay to, or you see the nurse practitioner for that. Sometimes it's offered, sometimes it's actually just she sees complaints such as you're describing, and that becomes, and I know from my own experiences, for me, my children, etc., is that you kind of, that has become more of a norm. You say, I'd like to see the doctor about, and that it doesn't feel like an overt affront to that idea to say, actually, you see the X for that. And I imagine that's part of what you're describing there in terms of identity.
Absolutely. So signposting has come out in every bit of work that I've done as absolutely fundamental to the success of achieving the first contact within the first contact principle of the FCP. But that's massively variable, Jack. I've had practices, right, FCPs describe to me their first contact hit rate being 80%. 8 out of 10 patients are genuine first contacts. I've had other services described it as low as 10-20%.
Wow. So
the rest of those patients are coming via a GP still. And I think, again, that's the sort of thing that we need to be aware of. And physiotherapists spoke about their frustration of having to repeatedly go to GPs and say, look, that's not how the service is meant to be used. It's not the MSK service. And again, you can completely understand the GPs doing that. They've got a physiotherapist in the room next door. They know that the MSK service has got a waiting list of 4 months. Well, I'm going to send you to the desk to book and see the physiotherapist. So, you can understand them doing that, but it's definitely undermining and challenging the FCP principle. And it's not achieving the objectives, it's taking up capacity of the FCPs. So yes, the complexities go on and on and on, really. And these are all the sorts of things that, I've spoken about in the work that I've done that we need to think about. But over time, those things, I think, do change. It takes a lot of work from the FCP in role, and it takes a lot of education, and it takes time. And I think, we can just let this tick its natural course, and in 15, 20 years' time, we may be the default practitioner just through natural evolution. Or we can take a more proactive approach. The danger with taking a more slow, let's see approach is that the same thing happens that happened to self-referral physiotherapy, and it doesn't achieve that sort of ultimate aspiration, really.
Yeah, I think in principle, I end up being hugely optimistic, both in terms of, especially if we can mature the conversation around the self-referral come FCP non-distinction we've described. But also, I just think that the principles are sound. Patients, we know, consistently love it when they get access, and that therefore, and all the accusations of safety concerns that sometimes come from various different quarters, etc., have never borne out in the literature or in any sort of analysis on service evaluation from what I've seen. Therefore, again, in principle, I'm loving it. I think my concern comes in practice. I can think of a number of different ways in which the persistence that is required, like you described, to educate the GPs, the GP practice, the pathway managers, the commissioners, as to what it is, what it isn't. I think that people get weary of that sooner than they need to, in part because it's something that, especially someone that's new in role in a practice, and to some degree because of the siloed isolation that's sometimes occurring in many of these new roles, which is very relevantly distinct to what you're describing in your team, which is nested within a service that therefore has the governance and competence and education and supervision that comes with that. When you've got the more isolated pockets, then becoming a yes man or woman for the GPs in that practice is a completely reasonable social phenomena to achieve. And obviously, I'll talk to you a little bit about sociology of kinship and identity within these practices, which I know is part of what I've read in your PhD. Which kind of I think, therefore, the burden that is on the FCPs to do the important work that you're describing is that if they notice that in their diary that they've just a double click on System 1 or EMIS means that a GP has then moved one of their patients in for a consult. You think that's good that they care and value their physiotherapy colleagues' opinion on, and sometimes even it's in there as a joint assessment or whatever. That's not the point. To push back hard on that when you've not necessarily you're not even attached to the wider pathway. You're just in there as a colleague within that practice. I think because the system doesn't protect that clinician, or that new model doesn't necessarily protect that clinician, that's why in practice, I lose a lot of my optimism, because I think that just doesn't seem, it's got too many points of failure, I guess. I just wondered if I could, admittedly, just that's me and my opinion as it stands. I just wonder what your thoughts are on those concerns.
I think there's some truth in it. I think that, I hear physiotherapists and GPs talk about how the physiotherapist becomes embedded in the practice, how the physiotherapist becomes part of the general practice team when they attend the practice. It's the same person attending the practice regularly. And my first take on that is that that's really advantageous. Yeah. They become a really intrinsic and valued part of the general practice team, to the point where they're not seen as somebody who's employed by the secondary care trust who's coming out to them. They really do seem as if they become embedded in the practice. And I've always taken that as being a really, really positive thing. What was interesting in the data collection on the second round of data collection in the national evaluation is that it seemed like things have evolved. When Fiona Moffat, Paul Hendrick and myself looked at our original evaluation qualitatively, there was this almost covert way that GPs and advanced practice nurses checked the physiotherapist's notes to see what they were doing. And what they said is they found that was a bit of a way of upskilling, but it was done so the physiotherapist assessment is really comprehensive, do a really good job. But it wasn't done in a very overt way. It was a bit sort of covert and a bit sort of checking almost. And I'm sure some of that was also to do with the GPs just checking that the physiotherapists were competent. But in the second round of data collection in the national evaluation, that changed. And there was a real celebration, a real overt celebration of the MSK skill set that the physiotherapist brought into GP practice. So it wasn't just physiotherapists going and knocking on the GP's door for non-MSK problems. It was GPs coming and talking to the physiotherapists about patients that they were seeing, and they needed some advice from the physiotherapists around MSK speciality. So I think that was something that was perhaps not valued in the early days, and it is really seen as valuable by the general practitioners. But I can understand what you're saying, that there is a danger with that sort of evolution of the physiotherapist as an individual within the general practice team, that they might feel pressurized to become a little less sort of FCP, this is what FCP should be doing. So that's the danger with bringing in some flexibility, that they become a little bit of a, oh yeah, I'll see them 4 times and I'll do, yeah, okay, I'll do a little bit of massage for this patient or whatever it is. But that's the danger with the flexibility, that they lose that first contact sort of more transformatory role that the FCP was originally put into practices. But I think that as long as that's done in an open way, it doesn't necessarily have to undermine the FCP principle. But what it does mean is there needs to be a damn sight more capacity to be able to have that flexibility. And you know, when you talk about, you know, what's the vision and what are the challenges? Well, the challenges, you know, certainly are around finances and funding to make enough capacity. Because I don't think I've spoken maybe one GP practice where they could very, very clearly say that the GPs were, maybe one or two, where the GPs were clearly able to describe a decrease in the number of patients that they saw with MSK problems. Because the capacity of most FCP services, particularly in England, is so limited that it's, you know, it's not going to really penetrate too deeply beneath the surface of the number of patients who go to a general practice with a musculoskeletal problem. You know, when I describe to people in Scotland and Ireland that in England we have one FCP for a PCN of a population of 50,000, they'd fall off their chairs. You know, they've got 1 per 10,000 and they're still not got sufficient capacity. So we've got a long way to go in terms of, you know, optimizing the capacity of FCP services.
I think one of the things as well, when I look at those numbers, I think that one of the things that sometimes gets missed is the fact that there isn't always a good differentiation between who's presenting with a primary MSK complaint and who has a secondary or tertiary MSK complaint alongside something that they would have seen a doctor about. And therefore that sometimes gets caught up in something that wouldn't necessarily be easy to differentiate, because as soon as you've uncoupled those problems, which could be arguably and sensibly considered advantageous to that person's care, it still doesn't necessarily do what is being described as being an efficiency exercise on the actual contacts for the NHS, for example. And so that, I think that's where that closer look at that data, as well as how that maps onto the experiences and the subjective variables that you've studied, I'm looking forward or hoping that gets unpicked. One of the models that's as old as the ones that we're describing, if not older, is the fact that, and sometimes people miss this for some reason, is that GP practices, many of them are independent, for-profit businesses, and they can employ a physiotherapist, and they still can, and they have done for many years, right? And especially something that I've noticed, and I don't have the data on this, but certainly again on my travels, is that you have affluent areas of which then that practice is doing particularly well, and they consider that to be a useful thing to have for their patients, and so they employ a physiotherapist in situ, and that ends up being quite mixed. Some of those clinicians have a mixed caseload of what would be considered FCP work, of which a patient has been triaged by reception or otherwise, or even by virtual triage from the GPs into that, or it could be a cross referral from a doctor, and that's the given. That's been 10 plus years worth of care. Because that continues to exist and it muddies that water, that doesn't corrupt the principles that we're describing. But for me, this is why the messaging has to be crystal clear. Is because whilst those things can coexist, if we don't get the messaging right within the profession, amongst the policymakers, as well as then trying to make sure we're speaking with one voice to the patients, to the communities, especially through marketing campaigns, of which should emerge if we're sensible for the reasons we've talked about. I think that for me means that the odds aren't necessarily in our favor. It can be redressed, but if we ignore it, or no, that's not what we're talking about, I just can't see how we can sort of mature that. Has that happened in your locality at all, or is that something that you've heard about from your studies?
No, and I think it's still a massive gap, Jack, in terms of articulating very, very clearly the message, and that's why I think it needs to go broader than FCP. It needs to go physiotherapy. The CSB had a strap line a few years ago, which was Think Physio, and I think that's a really useful strap line, for this agenda. people, as I said, I keep repeating myself, we want people who wake up with a musculoskeletal problem to think physio. That should be their point of access. You're absolutely right, though, with your first point in terms of the real complexity of teasing out the unburdening of GPs and the sort of the counter argument that the patient leaves a GP consultation and says, "Oh, by the way, doc, I've got a stiff shoulder," and that will never go. That won't go. But like I said previously, in terms of the dentistry, people can have a sore tooth, but they think of the dentist. The person who has a stiff shoulder, you could maybe imagine a point where the patient doesn't mention that as they're leaving the room, because they think, well, that's something that I'll speak to the physiotherapist about. I need to go and sort of book that appointment as well. So, you could see that perhaps getting to that point, but at the moment, you're absolutely right. There needs to be more work done on the objective empirical unburdening of GPs. But there's also a sort of associated sort of thing that we need to be aware of, which is the sort of narrative that came from the general practice workforce in terms of unskilling of GPs around MSK health complaints, with the knowledge that patients will say to them, "Or what about my stiff shoulder, doctor?" They have to have some MSK skill set. So one of the models that I've been sort of playing over in my mind is to have a GP practice that throughout the week runs defined musculoskeletal clinics where you've got a GP and a physiotherapist working alongside each other in separate rooms, working alongside each other. And that would fulfill a lot of the concerns that exist. So we know that socioculturally, patients default to their GP, okay? They have a confidence in medicine that they have for no other healthcare professional. So that would allay that concern, because there would be a GP working within that clinic. So if it was you could sort of say, well, there's a doctor there as well as a physiotherapist, and you could randomly assign patients. What you could also do in that model is you could do a comparative evaluation of the efficacy of the GP compared to the physiotherapist. So I think it would start to answer a lot of questions, because if you modeled the number of those clinics a week to the anticipated demand of patients with MSK problems, and we can do that. We know how many GP consultations there are in a week. We know roughly what percentage should be MSK. We create that capacity. The rest of the GPs within the practice should be seeing very few, if any, patients with a primary musculoskeletal problem. So you then also start to be able to measure more accurately the impact that first contact musculoskeletal clinics, in this case, would have on GP workforce and experience. Now, you could do that solely with physiotherapy FCP services. You'd need more capacity within a GP practice, within an individual practice, to be able to measure that. And then you wouldn't get that sort of reassurance that patients are seeking about there being some medical input within that clinic. And that would be a sort of step to sort of, ultimately just having physiotherapists providing those services. I don't know if that makes any sense.
It does, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, within your PhD, there's some really rich material that I had to read a few times with regards to sort of sociological analyses of professional identity. There's even sort of discussions of Foucauldian analysis of power, as how that's perceived within the structures and hierarchies within healthcare, within medicine, etc. But one of the things that I've found interesting in my journey on especially through MSKR, etc., is that we've increasingly been speaking what we consider to be more counter-tribal language amongst MSK professionals, and not necessarily then leaning into physiotherapy as one. That's something that we've suggested as being that, from us on a governance level and an education level with the variety, that therefore what we describe as being the flavour certificate on someone's wall, not necessarily making as much of a difference to the quality and competence. We saw no evidence of that being appropriately gate-kept in such a way that we could make that distinction inherent to the badge. Now, that's an easy thing to say across sector, with regards to private, with regards to sport, independent sector, charities, etc. Whereas in the NHS, the vast majority of MSK clinicians are physiotherapists. Do you think that rhetoric such as what I've just described from me and mine, does that end up spoiling and murkying the conversation such as what you're having, where the Think Physio is a cleaner message, and also one that I'm supportive of in that context. I'm sort of now grappling from listening to you as to whether or not, are we helping or hindering there? What's your sort of take on the physiocentricity of what you're describing?
Yeah, no, I'm aware it's very, very physiocentric. My whole stance was that, from a sociology of the professions perspective, FCP was the latest manifestation of physiotherapists or physiotherapies professional project. It's trying to, physiotherapy as a profession is trying to sort of, capture a market which is part of its professional project. And I think previously we've seen physiotherapy as a profession do this. The sort of massage scandals at the end of the 1800s, the world wars, particularly World War I, gave physiotherapists a real opportunity. And I think the sort of the financial crisis, the aging population, the sort of the difficulties and challenges to the GP workforce have provided physiotherapy with another window of opportunity, and FCP fits into that window of opportunity quite nicely. So I'm aware my perspective is very physiocentric. I am a physiotherapist, and I think that physiotherapists are well placed to take up this mantle. I think that because of the savviness of physiotherapy over the last 100 years, we are recognized as a very well established profession, more so than a lot of other sort of allied or sort of adjunctive professions, and certainly musculoskeletal professions. So we're well positioned to sort of realize this opportunity. And I think, Jack, I've heard you speak in the past about, if we as a profession don't realize this opportunity, there will be other professions who do. Mm-hmm. And, we've got the emergence and the increase in sports therapy courses and degrees, post and pre and postgraduate degrees, providing rehabilitative services. I think as a profession, we just need to be cognizant of the opportunities that are available for us. So yeah, it's difficult for me to because I've not really been exposed in the same way as you have in the work that you've been doing about trying to bring MSK professions together. So I'm aware that my sort of perspective is very sort of physiocentric.
It's a funny one, because I've been, one of the things that is the caveat I place is that it's open access based on the fact that we should all be reading a similar evidence base. However, I'm unapologetic about some of my physiocentricity on a pragmatic level with regards to workforce. Let's not pretend there's suddenly strength and conditioning coaches or psychologists who can work in pain management, or great functional scaled OTs, for example. It just isn't that workforce. So let's not be silly about the fact that, so it's more about the fact that accessibility and the fact that those distinctions can sometimes melt away when we're reading from the same evidence base, and that there may well be no difference if I'm working shoulder to shoulder with a contemporary chiropractor. It's something that shouldn't matter. However, what is fascinating for me, and why I often challenge our profession on this, is that if you're making claims of a relevant distinction there, if some of the public's perception and the established nature of what people perceive as going to see a physiotherapist meaning, I just want us to make sure that there's something credible more than just rhetoric there, right? I want us to be able to walk the walk. I want us to have some governance framework, some competency framework, some career infrastructure of which we can therefore justify those claims, rather than at the moment. I think there's a complacency that sets in. There's that word again. Maybe I'm paranoid about complacency of all flavors, but it's just that back it up with something. I'm kind of just irritated by my own career progression. My last NHS post I had, which unfortunately I got down to 2 days and I just got squeezed out from my many hats I wear, but I was working as an AA advanced practitioner within Staffordshire. And I was irritated at how that was a series of good job interviews, and hopefully, justified under a good supervised structure. So I didn't feel as much of an imposter as maybe I perhaps should have done. But generally speaking, it annoyed me that I was somewhat unchecked. It kind of annoyed me that there was no appropriate career infrastructure that could then mean that when I am working truly shoulder to shoulder with an MSK doctor, and we are behaving as peers, and you take one, I'll take one, which is, I know, something that you guys had done years before at City Care. It was somewhat of an irritant that the rhetoric of what physiotherapy is and could be, much of which I feel like I can recognise. I kind of just felt like, well, why aren't we backing that up? We're just not taking the opportunity to. There's so many skeletons that are in the closet there, that when we then come to talk about them, and we've sort of mentioned a few of them, you and I sound like accused of being almost heretics for unearthing that dirty laundry. Whereas that's something that I just feel like, well, let's just grow up a little bit, because the opportunity is huge. The patients love it. The actual, it is credible, but it's something that just needs that bit more support, a bit more thoughtful conversation. So anyway, I'm ranting a little bit there. But
no. I think it's really interesting, Jack, what you're saying. I would like to comment, and I think that obviously what will hopefully go a really long way to provide some of that reassurance that you're seeking is the HEE roadmap.
Absolutely.
And I think that's fantastic as an MSK framework. I think it would be good to see that same MSK framework for band 6 and band 5 physiotherapists. So you've got that real clear roadmap from start through to finish, not just at this higher level. And that might be something we see down the line. But I also think that, as I said, I'm a physiotherapist. My only experience is working as a physiotherapist. And I'm just sometimes a little bit concerned that we undermine those local competency frameworks. We undermine that process of interview and recruitment ourselves. And I think that's right that we hold a mirror up and we ask those questions. But at the same time, we have to be sort of careful we're not just undermining it for the sake of undermining it. In the same way as we have to be careful of not overinflating other people's frameworks. Now, I've no experience firsthand of going through the revalidation process as a doctor. Okay, I know what my own PDR is like each year, so I can only comment from a first-hand experience of that. I just wonder whether if I'd had 20 years of going through revalidation as a nurse or as a medic, I might feel similarly about that process as you have described, and perhaps I sometimes feel about my revalidation, which is cursory or none at all, but my PDR and my objectives and my sort of local sort of maintenance of my competency and my local assessment of my sort of ability to do the job that I'm doing. And I think that's just something we need to just be sort of maybe keep an eye on as well, because I think that my experience is that talking to people, the doctors who I talk to repeatedly say, oh my God, the physiotherapists are so much better at assessing somebody with a musculoskeletal problem. So whatever sort of systems we've got in place at the moment, and it may be that they're blinded by ignorance, but on the face of the evidence that I've got, whatever systems we've got at the moment seem to be doing okay. And that's not to say that getting this roadmap rolled out isn't absolutely the right thing to do. And as I say, I'd like to see that for all levels of musculoskeletal physiotherapy. I think the other thing to say is that one of the things that really interested me in my PhD in this work was the expectation of some interprofessional rhetoric and discourse. And to some extent, because when in 2015 Karen Middleton had a piece in Pulse, I think it was, she had a piece on the BBC News website about first contact physiotherapy. At that time, the narrative was very much around unburdening GPs, and that's changed a lot since that time. But some of the responses from the RCGP and the BMA were really, really quite critical. So I went into this with a bit of an expectation that there might be a little bit of upset, and there wasn't at all really, or very, very little overt GP dissatisfaction with FCP. When you speak to them, they're overwhelmingly positive about it. They might not be using it properly, They might be sending the patients out their room to go and book an appointment with the FCP. So, you know, whether that hides something. But at the same time, as you said, the GPs had their business owners, and they would repeatedly say, the buck stops with me. If something goes wrong, if this physiotherapist does something wrong, if this nurse does something wrong, the buck stops with me. And they were really aware of the responsibility that they had for their general practice, which, you know, was something that I wasn't aware of. But also, again, more covertly, and I've not really picked this up most recently in the last sort of 8 to 12 months, but in the early days, GPs would say things like, and this was before a lot of physiotherapists had, you know, access for diagnostic referrals and things like that. They would make a request for an MRI scan. I'd read through the requests, and, you know, I'd send off the ones that I thought were appropriate, and I wouldn't send off the ones that I didn't. So there was almost, I sort of coined the phrase at the end of my PhD of this unconscious medical dominance, which I don't think GPs were necessarily aware that they were exercising their dominance hierarchically within, but I think that they were doing on occasion, and I think that's, you know, that's a challenge for us as an, you know, allied health professional. We're allied to medicine. I think that's often how you know, some people in the profession see us still allied to medicine, and I think that's something that we need to step up to and challenge if we see it.
I'd agree with that. I think with a couple of things there, because you've spoken to two really credible and primary concerns that people have over some of what I've talked about the interprofessional, counter-tribal blurring of the lines sometimes between MSK disciplines. The first one being that sometimes you romanticize or over-glamorize other people's frameworks and competency. And I think that that's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things admittedly we did is that instead of our perception, we really did the reading. You know, we had to be reading job descriptions and going through it, and even sitting some, although fortunately I didn't have to submit them, but sitting some exams of which my GPs with special interest counterparts would have needed to do in terms of trying to understand the thresholds of which they did in order to then work shoulder to shoulder. And it's more the case that I think I'd love to be able to say that my observations aren't dissimilar to yours in terms of the fact that a lot of doctors say defer to physiotherapists, especially those that are more long in the tooth. They're just interested in the fact that, you know, much sooner someone saw them. In fact, they would consult a physiotherapist for their sore knee than they would a colleague or themselves. So they kind of get that, but let's just back that up then. That's all I'm kind of suggesting. It's not as if I'm inferring that actually that process would only unveil us to be incompetent. No, it'd be more the fact that why don't we then do that? Why don't we test ourselves in that way, of which, of course, the roadmap helps us to do, as well as the new exam that we're championing as well through the, hopeful aspiring Royal College of Sports and Exercise Medicine come MSK. But I suppose the other thing is that do we sometimes therefore talk down or overanalyze our own professional standards? And I think that that's the thing that I find interesting, is that based on what you've been describing, the process in which we then sometimes are vulnerable to that unconscious medical dominance is that to some extent it irritates me that they've got a leg to stand on in the fact that we are otherwise ungoverned. The fact that we're otherwise unchecked, the fact that we self-certify under the HCPC, the fact that our GP counterparts have at least been examined on it. You could criticise, as I plenty do, their exam, but generally speaking, especially your consultant sports and exercise medics come MSK doctors, as we know them, to some extent, the argument that any given individual might not be as good as any given physiotherapist is less important to me in terms of the actual governance standards and thresholds of which they've met. So if we're suggesting, and rightly so, I think I agree with your point that we're right up there, just prove it. It's not as if that's kind of what I'm meaning. It's more rather than saying that, oh, it'd be a really massively revealing moment if we did do that. I think it'd only shine us in good light. But I just think that it's not accidental that we haven't. I think that to some extent it has been convenient for us to otherwise people have been incredibly surprised at the fact, in the public, especially with our patients that we consulted within MSKR's work, were so surprised to hear that following graduation of an undergraduate, unless you voluntarily put yourself through further study, of which you and many others have, then you otherwise see your career out at that level, call yourself chartered, call yourself advanced, call yourself consultant, that fascinated people. And I think that speaks to that public perception thing, that obviously I'm loving your work. And I think that it adds the credibility and robustness to the things that are your PhD speaks to the fact that how well placed physiotherapists are to take this on. It's just that you undermine yourself by just not doing the due diligence almost underneath it. So I hope that unpacks a little bit more of my thoughts on it, and hopefully you can see why it's so supportive of your conclusions to your PhD.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as I say, I think at the moment, my experience and involvement extends to the roadmap, and I think that's a fantastic framework to sort of provide that validation for MSK physiotherapists working in primary care or general practice. So I think that's a great step forwards. So that's good.
Do you see the let's bring this to a close by getting your take on where you see the I want to question your optimism for the future of FCP, physiotherapy, the MSK industry, and the UK healthcare in this sphere. Do you see that as being, how optimistic are you for that, and how has that changed from your pursuit of this study?
I think I'm optimistic by nature. So I'm optimistic that this will continue. There seems to be some momentum around FCP. So I suppose fundamentally my headline is I'm optimistic. We've touched on some concerns and some cautions already, and there are some that I have. I think that as a profession we need to be clear about where we see this agenda going. For me, that is the agenda becoming broader for whatever you want to call it, think physio or physio first, or MSK physiotherapists becoming the first point of contact default for people who wake up with an MSK problem. And I've said that lots of times before. So I think that if that's the vision that we have as a profession, then that's going to take some really much broader thinking and planning about how we take the agenda forwards. I think that we are incredibly well and fortunately positioned to seize that challenge because of the sort of the acknowledgement that the public have and recognition that public have as physiotherapists and physiotherapy as a profession. So we're starting from a really advantageous position to be able to sort of seize that challenge. So that would be my sort of vision. But that's not FCP, that's physiotherapy. That extends beyond FCP. But that, as I say, there's definitely some broader thinking that we need to do professionally if we're going to achieve that.
That seems relevant. What you struggle to make that distinction in part because you see them as being so intrinsically linked. That FCP, you struggle to, for the reasons we've talked about, see it as being relevantly distinct from the wider professional, what did you call it? Professional project.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think at one point I was more concerned. I could almost see that there was an agenda for professionalizing, FCP outside of physiotherapy. It almost felt like, physiotherapists who are in these roles didn't like using the word physiotherapy. They called themselves advanced practitioners or musculoskeletal practitioners. And I think that the strongest public marketing point that we've got is the word physiotherapy, because that's recognizable. Advanced musculoskeletal practitioner means even less. If we think that people are somewhat confused about what physiotherapists do, they'd have no idea what that meant. So, that in a way, I'm glad that that's changed to FCP. We're a little bit fortunate that, P actually stands for practitioner, but, we can replace it with physiotherapists, first contact physiotherapists. So at one point I was a little bit anxious that it was going to be some sort of an identity in its own right, but that doesn't seem to be the case now. I think that more broadly from what you call MSK industry, I think that what I was going to say around working alongside GPs and professional protectionism and the lack of it is that when you work with people, if you go into it with a bit of a protectionist attitude, what I found is very, very quickly that drops away. And sometimes I've gone into thinking, I'm not quite sure that I'm comfortable working with, for example, this pain consultant. And when you get in the clinic room, what you realize is that very often, more often than not, your agendas are the same. And I think that exposure to that multidisciplinary working is only advantageous. And, I think the work that you're doing in terms of pulling the MSK industry as a wider body together is really great, because I think that all that will do is break down boundaries and barriers. And I think that's really important, not necessarily for First Contact, but I think for the MSK, what you call it, MSK industry.
Yeah. I think that's really heartening to hear. And I think one of the things that we've concluded on a sort of, for me, it'd be almost like a far from academic, but almost sociological part of that is that we don't feel like those professional badges are necessarily the primary identity compared to being a healthcare provider that's aspiring to deliver best care for that patient. That's one of the reasons it melts away. Even when people have got quite a large chip on their shoulder and that think that is really relevant, it does melt away, in part because you're shoulder to shoulder with someone that's just so aspiring to do the best for the patients, and that is the primary identity in that context, and that matters more, and so that cuts through far better. So I'm pleased we've come to similar conclusions there. I can't help but ask, did that optimism that you're describing wax or wane or change from the pursuit of the study? So as you studied this stuff more, did that therefore make you any more or less, or did it just stay the same throughout that?
Yeah. I think it's fluctuated, Jack, massively. Right. We had a massively successful service across, as I said, 20 GP practices. The money was non-recurrent, and when it came to the end of that contract, the money was pulled. So, we had a service that we could demonstrate was really efficacious and well received across the board, and it stopped overnight. So I think that's the sort of the reality of the world that we live in. Right. And that's something, again, that as a profession we need to be cognizant of in terms of securing a long-term agenda for FCP. So things like that really brought my sort of optimism down. I think recently some of the conversations I've had have really elevated my optimism again, and that's around what we spoke about earlier in terms of flexibility. Because I can see that, physiotherapists providing first contact musculoskeletal healthcare for patients can be really variable. It can be variable in terms of geographical situation. It can be variable in terms of type of service delivery. And that variability is really, really exciting. I think it requires, as I've said, us to let go of some of the rigidity in the FCP model, and you've alluded to that as well. But I think that those conversations, talking to physiotherapists in rural Scotland who've said the patients love it. They love the fact they've not got to travel for 2 hours, because of what I've brought to the service. The GPs love it. Most physiotherapists, all physiotherapy services that have been embedded into GP practices have been overwhelmingly welcomed, and the reports have been overwhelmingly positive. So, again, I'd like to imagine, and this might be my naivety, that in 15, 20 years' time, we're going to see a really diverse, flexible model of people accessing physiotherapy as a first point of contact. That would be my sort of dream outcome for this initiative and agenda, really. Yeah, so that optimism's still there, but without a doubt, there are still some challenges ahead, I'm sure.
Absolutely. No, well, thank you for exploring that with me today. Really appreciate it. I think there's definitely some policy level stuff, especially with regards to why it is that characters such as yours and work such as yours doesn't directly influence policy, especially with your name in lights and some of the awards that you won last year. Kind of drives me crazy that services such as what you're describing would be pulled despite demonstrable outcomes is the messy nature of politics, and that's one for another day, certainly. Thank you so much again for your time. Just tell people where they can find out a little bit more about you, what direction that you would send people for that.
Well, I try and avoid Twitter. I have got a Twitter account, but I sort of logged on yesterday and had lots of notifications for me, bearing in mind I don't have many followers. So don't send me anything via Twitter, because it's unlikely that I'll respond to it very quickly. If people want to get in contact with me, probably what's best for them to do, Jack, rather than me sitting here and giving my email address over this forum, is to sort of direct them to you, and I'm quite happy for you to direct people through to me.
That's right. We'll triage a bit of that for you, because I think you would be inundated, and rightly so, because your work has been so pivotal on this.
And Jack, just one thing I want to bring up. You sort of said about, somewhat frustrating that my work's not been, perhaps incorporated in some policy. To be fair, probably the thing that makes me proudest is the local service evaluation that we did, that was published in 2015. If you talk about research going from paper to practice taking 20 years, well, from a publication in 2015 to national policy in sort of 3 years is just remarkable. And the number of people who've said that in the conversations that they had with their commissioners, they took that paper, that makes me incredibly proud. And the CSP, as I say, have been really supportive of the work that I've done. So I would like to think that, and certainly with the national evaluation, they were just over the moon with the qualitative data. It just gives such rich information. And I'm doing interviews, as I've said, at the moment, and I've been doing this for 7 years, Jack. And every time I have a conversation with somebody, there's a couple of new nuggets that just go, oh my gosh, this is just fascinating. It's just so rich. It's a fantastic methodology in terms of unearthing really, really rich and useful information.
Absolutely. I think it's a great point, and certainly something I should really qualify is, for me, it's more that some of the nuance to the conversation, like we've described it with regards to self-referral, how that maps onto FCP. I suppose that's the thing where it's almost like some of the je ne sais quoi that Rob Goodwin's brought to this, that thoughtful, rational analysis, but also with a recognition of the patient perspective. It's that I feel like I'd love to see further influence the conversation, whereas you're absolutely right. The influence that you've had and your team's had in actually directing policy, that separation is relevant, and it was clumsy of me to not tease those apart, because you have been a great influence and continue to be. So thank you so much for all you've done. And definitely, I look forward to speaking again, hopefully in person over a beer. I want to make sure I put on record as well before we go. As a fellow twin dad, you've been a massive support for me there as well. Thank you for that. That's been brilliant, just to give me the pep talk I needed in the early days to say it gets easier. And so that's been an interesting thing that we also share. And so thanks again.
Yeah. No, it's an absolute pleasure, Jack. And it's one of the things that I do make a point of looking at on Twitter on the rare occasion, look at it, see how the boys are getting on. So it looks like you're doing really well. So yeah, enjoy that.
They're both still surviving. That's the key outcome measure that I'm using at the moment. But yeah, thanks so much as ever, and we'll speak again soon.
Okay, thanks, Jack.
Thank you so much for tuning in once again. Really appreciate Rob's time. Really enjoyed that episode, and great for me to catch up with him, even in this circumstance where I had to then put a microphone under his nose. But yeah, really one of the people that when I think back and look at his work, especially since I've worked with him, is we're just so lucky to have him. He's sort of a real unique talent and thinker within the profession, and he could turn his hand to many other things, and we're lucky to have him in MSK practice. So hope he continues to think in our direction and to continue to raise standards and think carefully about these sorts of things where clinical practice overlaps with policy reform, because it's an important thing that I'm passionate about. Do check out Rob's social media. As he admits, he doesn't use it often, but I'm sure he'd be open to some questions, or get in touch via us. Just let us know, info@physio-matters.com to get in touch. Remember to snap up your tickets, therapy-live.co.uk/tickets, or just shop around on that website and you'll notice there's lots of information about the speakers that have been announced and the programs and the streams, etc. So make sure you don't miss out on that. And as ever, thank you so much for your feedback. It's amazing how much you guys as a network and a community sort of help us feed into what you're wanting in terms of episodes, content, style, really decent constructive feedback as well that we get, as well as the hate mail. So I really do enjoy that. This episode is definitely testament to that. You wanted us to sort of do a deep dive into FCP, and I'm glad we were able to do that, and couldn't think of anyone better than Rob, and I hope you have enjoyed it too, so do let us know. All the best then, and it leaves me great pleasure to have forgotten once again to get Rob to do the sign out, so here I am instead. You've been listening to the Physio Matters podcast, discussing physio matters because physio matters. Bye for now.